everyone's potential is unlimited and endless. And it's really up to us to step into that potential. We have to train our mind to think differently about possibilities and think differently about ourselves. And I think we need daily intentions and daily routines to help us step out of our own way.
Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Grit Meets Growth podcast, where we bring you inspiration and insights focused on getting uncomfortable, making things happen, and creating a magnetic life. If you enjoy the messages you're hearing here, please leave us a review on whatever platform you're listening on, and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on future episodes of the podcast. With that, let's get after it. So we're excited today to introduce our guest to the podcast, Cindra Kamphoff. And just to kick things off, I'm going to read a little bit from an intro on her website that I think is going to set the tone really well for where we're going today. I began choosing courage each day. I began getting out into the world with my business as an entrepreneur, taking bold, courageous action each day. Each day I ask myself, what can I do today that is uncomfortable? That daily question has led me to do things that were scary for me once, like writing and publishing books, working with professional athletes and teams like the Minnesota Vikings and the United States Olympic track and field team, and speaking to thousands on the virtual or in-person stage. I now own my purpose and calling, reminding myself of my purpose each day and making decisions from my purpose. The purpose of my life is to be connected and inspired, to guide others to play and live full out by providing wisdom and the truth. So that's our introduction today to Cindra Kamphoff, and we're excited to have you on the podcast.
Thanks, John. That was powerful for a couple of reasons, mostly because you read my purpose statement. And that gets me every time. But I appreciate the way that you introduced us today. And I had a really big crucible moment in my life in 2013. I was actually at the Boston Marathon bombing. And since then, I've been really living what you just said and doing something every day courageous. And I think that is a great way to start this is, as people are listening, can they do something every day that's just a little bit courageous outside their comfort zone? And I think that's the key to grow and ultimately live into our potential.
And you work a fair amount with executives and with high performing athletes. Mm-hmm. And so what is your driver for that? And really, what are those roadblocks that you're helping them get through?
Yeah. So good question, Chris. I'd say, my driver ultimately is, when I was in high school, I was a really successful runner and ran the fastest mile in the state of Iowa my senior year. So I broke multiple records, some that still stand today. And at that point, I expected to become an Olympian. Those senior yearbooks where people, your senior year, you buy a yearbook and then all your classmates write your name and write like a little note on what they think you're going to do. And so my yearbook was full of, well, I can't wait to see you at the Olympics. And most of my classmates, I thought I was going to go there. I thought I was going to go there. And it was actually when I got to college that I completely got in my own way, just struggled from my own mindset perspective, from a mental health perspective, just was able to perform really well in practice, but not in the meets. And I think when you just asked me that question about where does this stem from, it really does stem from that point is I know what it's like to get in my own way. And I also know what it's like to actually master my own mind and build dreams that I'm excited about and every day, right? Live with purpose. And I think that's a really big difference. And I think of the work that I do with entrepreneurs or elite athletes. My company works with all types of athletes. And I see when people are really on purpose, connected to really what they want and living intentionally, it's a game changer. So I think that's ultimately what drives me.
Yeah, I've been through many of those instances myself, my life, and it's much of what we talk about here on this podcast, right? It's really, really easy for us to get in our own way. It's really easy for our mind to take over and to tell us we can't do something, even though, our bodies pretty much will do whatever we tell it to do. We can achieve greatness if we can get our mind out of the way.
Yeah, and I think what's helpful to know is that our mind's natural tendency is to keep us safe and to keep us comfortable. And for us to really choose to step into our potential, which to me, everyone's potential is unlimited and endless. And it's really up to us to step into that potential. We have to train our mind to think differently about possibilities and think differently about ourselves. And I think we need daily intentions and daily routines to help us step out of our own way, because naturally we're going to experience self-doubt, or what Dr. Daniel Amen talks about in his book, Change Your Brain, Change Your Life, automatic negative thoughts, or ants, right? And I think that's helpful to know that everyone's brain goes there. And, I felt like when I was in college that I was the only one that experienced self-doubt. I thought I thought there was something wrong with me. And now I realize, hey, everyone experiences doubt. Maybe people don't always talk about it or don't experience it the same degree. But even professional athletes that I've worked with doubt themselves from time to time. So, that's everyone's natural tendencies.
Sure. Absolutely.
So what are some of the things you do with a professional athlete when they're encountering self-doubt and it's keeping them from performing at the level that they want to or that they can? Like, how do you help walk them through that?
Yeah. So that's a great question. I'm thinking as I answer this question in my work with some of the Olympic athletes that I've worked with. And there's one athlete I worked with 6 months before the Olympic trials, and she was ready to quit her sport. It was right after the pandemic. And so, just athletes didn't have as much experiences during the pandemic to compete. And so she was really lacking a lot of motivation. And at the heart of what we did is we talked about how confidence is a choice. And what I mean by that is it does take constant nurturing. It's not like we can just turn on our confidence like a light switch. I actually think really good athletes know that every day they have to fill their confidence bank. And think about your confidence bank is, like a bank full of money. We want $1 million in that bank account or more. And so there's things that we can do that drain our confidence, but also build our confidence. And so in my book, Beyond Grit, there's some research-backed ways of building confidence. One of the best ways to build your confidence is to remind yourself of your past successes and to really be clear, like a highlight reel, like imagery. Think about those past successes. And I would say sometimes daily. I think another thing that impacts our confidence is how we're perceiving what's going on in our lives and how we're perceiving failure or successes. This particular athlete, we talked about confidence was, part of our conversation every other week. It was constant where we were really talking about building confidence. But one of the things that she did was to remind herself of her past accomplishments. She had like a poster board she put in her kitchen. And when she had small successes, she would actually just put a picture of it or like a statement about it or stats of the day or something like that. And this was like this image about her confidence that was sort of like her confidence bank, right? And that kind of just provided her some evidence that she has what it takes, because I think if we listen to our mind is naturally going to tell us what we're not instead of what we are. So that's why we need some really specific ways to build confidence.
Do you find those visual cues like that are key? I've got a dream board, right, of things that I want to achieve. But the way you're talking about it is more of these are the things I have achieved, right? And maybe pairing those two kind of really is a fantastic driver to move beyond that, imposter syndrome.
Yeah. And what's really interesting, Chris, is, at this point in my career, I only work with high performers, people who really have big dreams, either in their business or in their life or in their sport. And one of the top trends I see, so I'd say like, this is what I talk to most about with people, is this idea of they lack confidence and they feel like an imposter, which kind of I just want to normalize that as well, as because I think perhaps like the more successful you get in your career, the more you question, if you're going to be found out as a fraud, or because ultimately that's what imposter syndrome is these thoughts that, maybe we aren't successful enough, or someone's going to find us out, or do we really know what we're talking about? And I think that's helpful to know that really high performers have those ideas and feelings like they're an imposter.
I deal with them often in this podcast, in my role at Octelliant. Like, am I good enough? Is this what I'm supposed to be doing? Right. I mean, our minds kind of go to that place, and it's not something that I necessarily struggle with, but I do have those thoughts and need to kind of push through on a time to time basis.
Mm-hmm. In my new book, Beyond Grit for Business, I have a tool I call the truth meter. And this is where we take a step back once we've identified a thought that holds us back. And it's just 3 quick questions we ask ourselves. So here's Chris, I'm going to give you the truth meter to think about that question. Are you doing enough? Okay. Or is that really the underlying disempowering thought, do you think? Or is there another thought that maybe we could use the truth meter around?
Is that the first question?
No, I guess maybe a clarification question. Is this the thought we should put through the truth meter? Am I doing enough? Or is there a more disempowering thought that you have related to imposter syndrome?
No, I would say that's a good one to start with.
Okay. All right. So the first question is that thought true?
No.
Okay. How is it not true?
Are we really doing this right now?
Yeah, why not? We can skip your answer if you'd like, but I'll let you decide what you answer. But here's the
I'm starting to sweat over here now.
I know, I can tell. So here's the 3 questions. Is this thought true? Is this thought serving you? And what's a more empowering thought that you could choose right now? And I think the idea of that is that most of our thoughts aren't true. Most of our thoughts don't serve us. And it's likely that we can always choose a more empowering thought in the moment.
Yeah. I'd agree with that, right? It's a change in perspective, ultimately, right? It's just looking at things differently. I'm fortunate enough in my business relationships that I've got an awesome business partner who looks at things through a different lens than I do. And so we really are a good yin and yang when it comes to that, because if I do have those thoughts around limitations, he's looking at it from a different perspective and brings that different view. Well, what about, right?
Yeah.
And so
that's helpful, because absolutely. I think we need people to support us and tell ourselves the truth. There's another professional athlete that I worked with that went to the Olympics, and I remember asking her this question in my first conversation with her. What is it that you really, really want? Right. And she said, well, I want to get to the Olympics. And we are kind of brainstorming the things that she needed to believe about herself to get to the Olympics. So she said, well, I need to believe that I'm one of the best long jumpers in the world. And I need to believe that I'm talented and smart and fit. And we were just kind of brainstorming. And at the end, I said, well, what if you just believed you were an Olympian? And she was like, oh, I don't know. I don't know if I could believe that. Right. And then she said, well, Miss Cindra, I think you believe that I can become an Olympian more than I believe it, and so I had to tell her why I thought she could become an Olympian. And just like, just like your business partner, sometimes we need, it's helpful to hear that from other people. Hey, this is what I see in you. This is what I see your strengths are. And this is why I know you can be successful.
Right.
You know what I love about this conversation too, is it's a permission slip to have that first thought. Like, we're all going to have that first thought where we're like, I don't know if I'm enough. I don't know if I'm capable. I don't know if I'm an imposter. That just comes in, and we can't always control that. But what we can control is what we do with it. We don't have to hang on that. We don't have to sit on it. We don't have to spend time with it. We can redirect that pretty quickly if we catch it right away and implant a new thought on top of it, rather than stewing on it and camping out on it for too long. So,
and John, I think the definition of the word automatic means that we don't always choose the thoughts, and sometimes I think we believe we are our thoughts, and if I have a thought of like, I'm feeling like an imposter, that we think that we are an imposter, but I think it's helpful to just say, hey, that's just a thought I had, and I don't need to believe it. And I can let that thought just float out of my mind. And I don't really need to give it any energy, because that was just an automatic negative thought. And sometimes I laugh it off, I'll be like, there you go again, Cindra. Not always. Sometimes I can get stuck on my thoughts, especially if it's something really important to me and I feel like I let myself down or let other people down. But it's important, and we know what our triggers are and what gets us kind of spinning.
So you have your book, Beyond Grit. And in the book, one of the things that attracted us to this conversation is that you talk about grit quite a bit, which is a perfect fit for us, obviously. But you have the 10 practices of high performance in the book. Can you talk a little bit about those and what some of those practices are?
Mm-hmm. Yep. So good question. So the first practice is grit, and we can talk more about that next. And the other practices help build our grit. And there are 10 practices that are backed by research that we know in the research on high performance that lead to high performance. So first one is grit. The second one is connection to your purpose. Third is mastering your thoughts. And that's actually just kind of what we've been talking a little bit about, is our automatic negative thoughts and how to really be a master of what you're thinking about. 4 is growing in your self-awareness. So it's called know yourself to master yourself. 5 is dominate the controllables, which is really hard to do, but the center of everything. Practice number 6 is about owning the moment and staying in the present moment. And we know that high performance only happens in the present moment. And practice number 7 is about choosing to feel good and choosing empowering emotions, even when it can be difficult. 8 is owning who you are, and that's all about authenticity. 9 is living and letting go, which is the most difficult for people to practice. And 10 is where we started this conversation with choosing courage over comfort, and the idea of like doing something every day that's just a little bit scary. And it's based on an Eleanor Roosevelt quote. And she said, when we do something every day that's just a little bit scary, we are able to step into our purpose and do what we really love to do. So I actually think they're all kind of connected and work with each other. But just what I said there is courage is connected to our purpose. And I think the way that we live our purpose is choosing to be courageous. And think about courage as like a muscle. It's not something we have, right? But we have to practice. Just like I thought a lot about, what do I call these 10 things? I'm like, are they habits? Are they practices? What are they? And ultimately, they're not things we're born with, but we can practice them. And some days I feel like I'm really great at maybe 5 and number 10. Some days I'm not so great at 5 and 10. So the idea is that, for us to thrive, these are 10 practices that we need to practice every day, that we're not born with, and that they can fluctuate.
I love the idea that you're saying that we're not born with these things, but that we can develop them and build them like muscle. Because I think a lot of times we get stuck on the fact that we're not born with certain characteristics or certain, like, I'm not born gritty. well, that's fine, but you can build that, and you build it over time, and you put yourself in situations and give yourself experiences that build that. I think that's something that probably gives a lot of people a lot of hope, because it's not locked in on what you're born with. It's, you can build these things up. So,
yeah. And
well, and I think too, to kind of add to that, Cindra, you know, when John and I came together and were looking to name this podcast and looked at what we wanted to accomplish and what the purpose of it was, somehow we kept coming to grit as really that foundation, and, you know, utilizing grit to achieve the growth that we want to see in our lives. But one of the things that we've never really kind of dove into was the definition of it, right?
Yeah.
What really is the definition of grit? And I'm curious, because when we were naming this podcast, your name and your book Beyond Grit was one of the things that came up. And I remember having that dialogue a couple of years ago with John. So the fact that you're here is fantastic. But I'm curious to understand what your definition of grit is. And I guess more specifically, what is it not?
Yeah, all really great questions. I've thought a lot about what grit is and what it's not. As someone who has a PhD and who I see myself as like a scholar practitioner, which just means I go back to the research. I have to go back to, the research about grit. And it ultimately was first defined by Angela Duckworth as having passion and perseverance towards our long-term goals. I think also a connection to our purpose it keeps us going. So that's why I would add to that. We did a study last year where we asked professional athletes how they developed their grit. And so we interviewed people one-on-one, really intensive interview process, and then transcribed all the interviews. And we were looking at what are the commonalities and how did they actually develop their grit. And guess what? They also said it's not something that they're born with. And there was an interesting part of the study that I did not expect. And they all had overcome difficult experiences in their life to become a professional athlete. And so I like to define this as like a crucible moment. The word crucible comes from a book called True North by Bill George. And he talks about just like a defining moment in our life. And so these athletes, for example, said it was their parents' divorce or their own cancer or a season-ending injury that actually helped them develop their grit. So when you think about, right, passion and perseverance and purpose and knowing what you want and staying with it and doing it even when it's hard and staying with, your goals even when you want to give up, right? All that sounds really good, like passion and purpose and perseverance, right? All really positive things. But grit can also come from really tough moments. And I think that's helpful that we can take a step back and say, okay, what am I learning? How can I grow through this, not just get through this? How is this an opportunity for me, right? And I think about my experience in college, which I just briefly described to you earlier. That was one of the most difficult times in my life, but it makes me really passionate about what I do now. I still think about that because ultimately it's my why. So grit is not something we're just born with. We can be born with those experiences, but it's likely also comes from how our upbringing and the people we surround ourselves with, and also how we're looking at difficult moments and how we're shaping those and the way that we're perceiving them and seeing them, the meaning we're making of those difficult experiences.
Right. And the response that we have to those.
Yeah. And what I think it's not is, so it's interesting because kind of during this time period of the pandemic, I've been speaking a lot about grit. And there was a school district I went into and was talking about my 10 practices. And I got some feedback that, they thought that grit, I meant that they just had to do hard things. And that's actually what grit is not, meaning grit is not about pushing yourself until you're ready to give up or pushing yourself until you can't go anymore or you're so exhausted. you can't get up and exercise in the morning, or you're not taking good care of yourself. That's not passion and, passionately pursuing your goals and knowing what your purpose is. I think grit really is thriving even when things are tough, and choosing to be focused on your purpose and like life-giving emotions instead of the opposite. So grit is not about pushing until you're ready to fall apart.
Right. Not about, it's not about lack of self-care. There's a plethora of self-care that needs to happen in order to really make the growth happen from that grit is kind of my perspective on it anyway.
Yeah. And I think grit can come from, like if people said, okay, I want to develop my grit, how do I do that? I think number one, it's getting some clarity on what your goals are long-term and short-term. Most people don't really know that. I read a stat that only 7% of people are visionary. So it's hard for people to kind of think about what they want, right? Number two, do you know what your purpose is? And have you spent some time really thinking about what your life's purpose is? That's a huge statement. That takes a lot of really discovery. Number three, you can grow your grit by talking to yourself really powerfully and optimistically and confidently. Number four, I think it's about how we're overcoming setbacks and moving on from difficult moments. Those are several ways to keep growing your grit, but I know that grit comes from being compassionate with yourself instead of beating yourself up. Because to keep going, I used to think that the harder I was on myself, the better I would do. But I quickly realized that's not the case.
I really appreciate this conversation because I think anytime you use the word grit and you include it in conversations like this, it's so easy to create this hustle and grind culture. And and that's all it's about. Like you said, Chris, self-care is not included in this. It's just hustle and grind. And eventually, if you grind something too much, there's nothing left. That's what happens on the backside of hustle and grind. If you don't take care of yourself and really, it includes self-care in this grit process. So I appreciate you sharing that and bringing that up.
Yeah.
Well, and I think in all of your 10 practices, Cindra, it's really, and grit as the foundation of this, it's consistency. It's doing these things every day, consistently. And if all we're doing is grinding ourselves down to a nub every day, there's no way that we can be consistent, right? That consistency comes from that self-care and from doing those activities, right? So I have to be able to set myself up to be able to continue to do those practices on a daily basis. Grit being one of them.
Yeah. And if you look at, the research and what contributes to high performance when we're consistently at our best and what contributes to flow, right? If we're not taking care of our basic needs, if we're not caring for ourselves physically and emotionally, none of that's possible. So I think that's important in this conversation, right? For people to experience flow and peak performance, they also have to be really mindful of what are they saying to themselves emotionally? How are they caring for themselves physically? If it's like eating and sleeping and exercise, things like that.
Can you speak? One of the practices that you talked about was owning the moment and staying present. And I feel like that's something that right now, especially for people, is really challenging. And it's something I'm challenged with every day. I have a hard time with it. So can you speak to that a little bit?
Yes, absolutely. So the practice number 6 is about owning the moment, and think about how your mind can be in 3 places, like the past, present, and future, right? And what's interesting is there tends to be some emotions that we experience when we're thinking about the past. For example, we might feel regret or frustration. In the future, that's actually where pressure and anxiety lives, is all in the future. And so sometimes when people come to me, and if it's an entrepreneur or a leader or a high level athlete, and I'm working with them and they're talking about a lot of anxiety they have, we talk about how it's future-based, meaning they tend to be focused on the future and usually like what could go wrong in the future. Now we know that we have, as humans, more difficult time than ever before to be in the present moment because our mind is, connected to our phone and we're constantly getting all of these, pings and alerts. And so we have a more difficult time. There's a great stat in my book, and I'd have to look it up again. I should know it because I wrote it. But it's like something like 75% of the time people are not thinking about what they're actually doing. It's pretty wild. I can look it up at the end of the conversation and maybe you can put it in the show notes. But the point is we struggle with this more and more. Ultimately, I would say is think about a high level athlete and they are incredible at staying in the present moment, right? They're not thinking about the next play or the past play. So there are ways we can train ourselves to do this. Ultimately, it starts with awareness, like where our mind is. And then we need to gently bring it back to the present. But that's why like elite athletes do mindfulness exercises or meditation exercises every day, because those things do train present moment focus. I've read about how LeBron James, right, does a mindfulness exercise every day. Even the Chicago Bulls for a long time had a mindfulness expert, George Mumford, who did exercises with them every day, right? So the point is if we want to be at our best, we need to train our mind to be in the present. Just naturally not going to go there.
Are there some things that we can do, or one thing that we can do that can help us bring us to that present if we start to drift?
Yeah, so I would say two things. I would say you could do some work as a preventative. And so even using an app like Headspace, or I like the app called My Life. And it's just there's a 3-minute mindful breathing exercise that's free on My Life. And so could you for 3 minutes every day, maybe as you start your day, just train your present moment focus. So that's what I would say is as a preventative. Second thing is what I find is having in the moment some kind of cue word to get our mind back to the present can be really helpful. So a couple of years ago, I was working with an NFL offensive lineman who was having a hard time staying focused in the huddle. And so if he didn't hear the call in the huddle, right, not good, messed the whole play up. And so we were talking about, what are ways that he could get back to the present moment. And he chose the word right here, right now. And so or the phrase right here, right now, right? Kind of be where your feet are. And in the present moment, that's where your mind is connected to your body. And so he would just use that at a certain time where he knew the play right before the play was going to be called as like a cue word. So sometimes when I use a cue word, for example, let's say I'm relaxing at night with my family, and all of a sudden I'm thinking about something I got to do tomorrow, and I'm not really present with my family. I just use the word like present just to get back. And you could take a deep breath, because your breath is always something you have, right? It's easy. Use the deep breath as a cue to get back to the present. So that's how I would like simply say it. There's other strategies in my book that I've found helpful as I work with people just to ultimately be their best. But those are a few tools people can use right away.
Awesome.
You have a tool in the book that talks about mistakes and difficulties. And I think if I remember right, it's tied to practice number 10.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think we've all got mistakes and difficulties that we've wrestled with. So if you could share on that, that'd be awesome. Yeah,
that's my favorite strategy in the book. So thanks for asking. maybe I'll tell a story before I tell the tool. So a couple of years ago, Adam Thielen of the Minnesota Vikings had this game where he fumbled really early on in the game. And an ESPN reporter saw him go over to the sidelines and make this action. Okay, so people can't necessarily see it if they're listening to us, but it's just this action where he's kind of looking like he's like turning a knob, right? And so it was a playoff game against the Saints. So obviously making, fumbling right at the beginning of the game is not a good idea in a playoff game, right? But next play, he was right back in really fast, right? And kind of just had this kind of next play mentality, which ultimately I think all of us need if we're a football player or not. How can we move on quickly? And so this mentality actually helped Adam, and the Vikings ended up winning the game because he caught this like 34-yard catch over his head. It was absolutely gorgeous and set the Vikings up to win the game. So Courtney, this ESPN reporter, went up to Adam afterwards and said, Adam, what did you do to move on so quickly? Because it can be really difficult for wide receivers to move on. So any guesses? What do you think his action was?
Flip the switch.
Flip the switch? Good guess. John, what do you got?
Turning a steering wheel?
Turning a steering wheel. So he said, well, I was pretending to flush a toilet. So there was the next day, all these people were like, tagging me on Twitter. And there's this really funny article that's headlined like mental coach taught Adam Thielen, Vikings Adam Thielen to flush away his mistakes or something like that. I'm like, that's how I get headlined at ESPN.
That's a great learning though. Like how many times do we sit and stare at it when we could flush it? That's phenomenal.
Yeah. So the story goes, I worked with the Minnesota State Maverick football team for, I think, maybe 9 years now. And the first year was when Adam Thielen was a senior on our team. And so Adam ended up writing the foreword to my first book, Beyond Grit. But the tool I was actually teaching the team at that point is something called Learn, Burn, Return. And the burn was his way of moving on, which was flushing a toilet. And his senior year, the Maverick football team actually had a tiny plastic toilet. It was about this size. And guys would go over there and pretend to flush the toilet if they had to let go of a play. And it's pretty funny. I heard recently that there was someone who missed a play. He didn't go out there because he was flushing the toilet, and I thought maybe I was going to get fired from the coach. Good thing I didn't. So the actual strategy that we all can use, and since then I've called it like a mental recovery tool, because our mind can kind of just be on this replay, right? Mm-hmm. Especially when things don't go perfect or we experience some kind of mistake or disappointment, we beat ourselves up. And we think the more we think about it, the better we're going to do. But I'd like to encourage people to think about, well, maybe after you take the lesson, you don't need to keep thinking about it anymore. And ultimately, when we keep our mind is on replay, think about it as like money out of our confidence bank. Taking money out of that $1 million, we want to keep it in. So first step we want to think is, what did I learn? Or another way to say that is, what would I do next time? And the next time is really important because you can't do anything about the past. Right. All you can do is take the lesson. And honestly, once you take the lesson, you don't need to think about it anymore. And so burn just means that you identify some kind of phrase or action. So Adam's action was flushing a toilet, but the phrase could be next play. Even if we're not athletes, we could just say next play, or sometimes I say burn it, or I also say that fast, and I snap my fingers that fast. And then the return means you build yourself back up. You reset your confidence. Maybe you use like an I am statement, like I'm strong, I'm smart, I got this, something to build your confidence back up. And there was several athletes that I worked with that were at the Tokyo Olympics, and one didn't have a great first day. And she said it was that tool that she just had to keep on reminding herself of. And then second day, she had a phenomenal day, right? But so many times we just kind of get stuck in feeling sorry for ourselves instead of just like intentionally moving on. I use this tool sometimes every day, at least every other day, to get unstuck. because my mind can overthink. Like I think a lot of people's mind can.
Yeah. Well,
I've seen,
and do you think that's really where the pressure comes from? Does the pressure come from our own mind and our own place to perform at that level?
Yeah, I would say pressure is always self-imposed. Like nobody can make us feel pressure. It, many times it's like unconscious. We don't consciously choose to feel pressure, but somehow we're taking in, maybe we're having our own thoughts that are creating pressure, or we're taking in external variables and how we're perceiving those external variables. But it's really like, it's us, right? I think that's also helpful to know that pressure doesn't always have to be bad, but usually it's because we're thinking about the future in a way that isn't always powerful or thoughtful, or mindful, I guess maybe would be the word I would say, that we're typically thinking about all the things that could go wrong instead of like what's possible and what could go right.
Sure.
so much of this happens subconscious as well. So
Yeah.
if we're not aware of it and we don't catch it and we don't
Yeah.
consciously capture those thoughts and do something with them, that subconscious, if we don't train it right, can run wild and go take us in a lot of different directions that we don't want to go.
It can. And I think that's the power of training your mind. And I think that's why it has to be a daily practice, is because so many times our mind can just be on replay and we aren't consciously aware of what we're thinking about and what we're focused on. And how are we building our own self-worth or our own self-image? And when you take a step back and say, well, what do I want to think about myself? Or what do I want to think about my future? Or how do I want to choose to perceive the situation instead of just going to default? I think that's where the power is. And I full disclosure, I still get in my way every day. Okay, so that doesn't mean that like the doubt goes away always, because perhaps maybe that helps us in some way, right? It doesn't go away completely, but I think that's why when you're really training your mind, you can live with purpose and live with intention and be your best more consistently.
Yeah, I saw an interview with a number of entrepreneurs running multi-million-dollar organizations, and the question was asked of them, do you deal with imposter syndrome? Mm-hmm. Right? Do you ever feel like you're not enough type of situation? Every one of them answered, every day.
Yeah.
Ed Milet being one of them, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
You would think, a guy like Ed Milet,
right,
like yourself, that talks about this stuff all the time, wouldn't deal with that. But part of the reason I think you talk about it all the time, and part of the reason that John and I talk about it, is because we deal with this. This is the stuff that we're dealing with every single day, right? The tools and techniques that you're using to get through that come from your own experiences.
Yes. Yeah. Isn't that so true? And I think we end up choosing the thing to teach, in some ways, it's related to what we struggle with the most, but I also think that when I think about someone like Ed Milet, who's really pushing himself, right, to get out there with his message and his podcast, when we're pushing ourselves, when we're really getting outside of our comfort zone and choosing to be courageous every day, I think that's when the imposter syndrome is more likely to creep up. Because if we're just comfortable, we're not going to necessarily feel like an imposter. If we're just kind of doing things we've always done and not taking risks and not speaking our mind and not getting out there with our message, we won't necessarily doubt ourselves because we've been doing the same thing over and over and over again when we're really pushing ourselves. So, sometimes I think one thing that could be helpful is just to notice that and say, okay, well, because I'm really pushing myself, maybe the doubt and the feelings of imposter are more likely going to happen. But here's my plan for when I do experience them. And I'm going to tell myself the truth. And I'm not going to let my thoughts just go to the kind of automatic pilot, because that's never helpful.
So I feel like a lot of this ties back to purpose. And you got very excited in the intro when we were talking about purpose and we brought up your purpose. I think purpose is a tough thing for people. I think they overthink it a lot of times. I think they get really stuck on how do I find my purpose? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. Great question. So my own connection and clarity with my purpose really starts, well, I don't know if it starts, but a crucible moment that happened to me in 2013 is I, at that time, was running marathons competitively. And even though I didn't do very well in college, I wanted to see like what I could do in the marathon once I had more like mindset tools. And so I was like, okay, could I try to get to the Olympic trials or something fun like that? And I had some good success. And there was a point where I was running the Boston Marathon and actually ran a personal best in 2013. And kind of, long story short, I was just a couple of blocks from the Boston Marathon bomb. And so our hotel was right next to Boylston Street where the bombing occurred. And so I was right there. It was a really scary moment because I didn't know if I was going to get home to see my kids again. And I didn't, there was rumors that there were multiple bombs throughout Boston and our hotel was just a couple blocks away. And I remember that day, when we were trying to figure out what was going on, I remember sitting in my hotel room and obviously we were pretty quiet because it was really scary and nobody was talking about their race anymore. It was like, that didn't even matter. And what mattered to me most was my family. And what mattered second was my purpose. And I remember asking myself, like, why am I still here? And, what difference do I make? And why do I do what I do? And most of the day, I just had questions about my purpose, like going through my mind. And so when I got back, I felt like I was a different person because this being at the marathon connected me back to my purpose. And I was on the search to really get some clarity on it. So I read a whole bunch of books. One of the books I read was called The Power of Purpose by Richard Leiter. And it's a really good book. And he talks about how when we understand our purpose, we live up to 7 to 10 years longer. And our purpose is vital for our health and our wellness and our well-being. And I don't think it's something that, I think it takes intentional effort and really understanding your purpose. There's some exercises I have in my book and workbook to help people go through that. And one of them is where you can write your purpose statement. And I go back to this a couple of times, probably like every 2 years or so, like what is the purpose statement I want guiding me right now? John, you read it. And then I have a grit board right here on my office that says, right at the top, it says the purpose of my life is to provide wisdom and the truth and help other people live full out. Right. And so ultimately, like, that's what I come back to is how can I now live that purpose every day? And I'm hopeful, even just by talking to you today, right? There's somebody listening that says, oh, I'm not playing full out. I can do something every day that's just courageous, right? And it wasn't until 2013 that I decided every day, okay, I'm going to do something just a little bit courageous, and that's not easy to do. So ultimately, that's why we need to get some clarity on our purpose. It is a big idea. So give yourself some grace. But I think giving yourself some space too, to really think about why is it that you do what you do? And how can you kind of live more from that purpose and use your purpose to guide you on what you say yes to or no to. Ultimately, reminding yourself of your purpose every day once you get clarity on it.
That's awesome. That's powerful.
Using it to guide what you say yes and no to is huge. Like I lived a long, big chunk of my life saying yes to everything. Because I thought people were going to like that. And I thought it was going to make an impact and gain friends and all those things. And it doesn't work. Like, you dilute very quickly if you say yes to everything. So.
Yeah. And I think when we're using our purpose to guide, what we say yes to or no to. Ultimately, we're saying yes to the things that light our soul on fire, and like yes to our genius zone activities. As I kind of think about some research on that, like the things that you're uniquely gifted at doing. So I think, but that starts with really understanding yourself and living in alignment with your purpose. And it starts with just giving yourself some space, maybe hiring a coach or having conversations with your friends about purpose, and write a first draft of a statement. The thing that frustrated me when I got back from the Boston Marathon bombing was like, I was trying to figure out how to write mine. And all the things I was reading showed you about the power of having the purpose, but I'm like, how do I write it? And so that's what I tried to provide people, is at least like a start to writing the purpose. And then you can decide how you want to change it or evolve it over time.
Well, it's a daunting task, right? Because everybody looks at it, this is big, right? This is going to set the tone for my entire life. And it doesn't have to be that way.
No, and actually you should be able to live your purpose through anything you do. So you could live your purpose through the podcast. You could live your purpose through your 9-to-5 job. You could, if you decided to go work at Walgreens, you could live your purpose through that, right? So I think sometimes people think that it has to be like always connected to your job. But I think discovering your purpose also allows you to think a lot about how are you at your best and how can you stay connected to that every day. In my new book, I have a routine that I call the grit priming routine, and I encourage people to do it in the morning. And it's just 4 parts. G stands for gratitude. So for at least a minute, you think about what you're grateful for. R is remember your purpose. So every morning you're reminding yourself, why am I here? And then I stands for intention. And this is what do you intend to do that day? Not about necessarily checking something off your checklist, but more like how you want to show up. And then T is all about talking to yourself. So what are the 10 to 30 statements you want to say to yourself every morning to build your own self-image to the way that you want to keep thinking about yourself? People can download that at beyondgrit.com/morning. There's a PDF there, beyondgrit.com/morning. People can download it and just, I try to give you some good takeaways there and some steps there.
So you have a new program called Beyond Grit Breakthrough. Can you talk a little bit about that? And then talk a little bit about how people can connect with you coming off the podcast. What does that look like?
Yeah, people can head over to Dr. Cindra, so DrCindra.com, and you can find the Beyond Grit book there, the new business book I have called Beyond Grit for Business. So that's over there. You can also head to beyondgrit.com. And if you want to learn more about our coaching or my speaking, you can head over to Dr. Cindra on that too. We are doing a Beyond Grit Breakthrough program starting in a couple of weeks, where I'm going to be doing some weekly teaching, which I'm really excited about. And we're diving into the first 3 practices of Beyond Grit. So the first one about grit, how do you develop it? And how do you get clarity on where you're going and why you're going there? And then number 2, we're actually be writing your purpose statement and doing some work around purpose. And then number 3 is mastering your thoughts and how can you level up your thoughts to help you stay gritty and on purpose. So I'm excited about that. First time we're doing it, which I'm pumped about, trying something new. And so if people want to learn more, I'm just going to encourage them to send me an email at Cindra@cindrakamphoff.com. If you also go to cindrakamphoff.com/breakthrough, there's just a landing page there where you can request a call with me.
So awesome. Multiple ways to
get to lots of ways. Lots
awesome.
of ways.
Well, I'm extremely grateful that you were able to join us today, and for this fantastic conversation. Truly appreciate it.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, John. It's been an honor to be here, and thanks for starting the podcast. I love the name. And I wish you the best in just building it and impacting thousands and millions of people.
Appreciate it.
That wraps it up for today's episode. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for being part of the Grit Meets Growth tribe. And thanks for growing along with us and being part of this journey together. If you know someone who needs to hear the conversation we had today, please share it. If you got something out of this conversation, please leave us a review. And finally, if you want to make sure you don't miss future episodes, just remember to subscribe. We're thankful for each and every one of you. And as my co-host and good friend Chris Cathers always says, make it a great day.